Well, what a day. Think of all the things you could be doing and you're here. Have you thought about why you are here? Because I've thought a lot about it. And to me, I've been wondering about what really church is. Is it a clique? Is it a club? Is it a community? And as I thought about those things, I went back to a little town that I visited in the US of A. And before we got there, I thought of this, and this is my scripture reading of today. Dear children, let us not love with words or speech, but with actions and in truth. Because words are cheap. Anybody can say things, but when you actually back up those words with action is when they count. But as I was posing the question to myself, why am I here? I went back to a little town in Washington State, Walla Walla. It's only got about 30,000 people, and it's right up on the west coast, just above Oregon. And in that little town, it's got a very small CBD, and in the middle of the CBD is this enormous building. It just seems to be out of place. It's 13 stories high, and it's the Marcus Whitman Hotel. And when you go inside, there's this opulence that doesn't seem to belong to this little country town, creating an image and an atmosphere of yesterday. In the middle of the town is what they call Pioneer Park, because Walla Walla is very proud of its pioneering traditions and heritage. And they have this magnificent sculpture in there of a wagon with an oxen, which you can see I'm riding there. But Whitman is a name that you see everywhere. There are streets, there are hotels, and just near the park is Whitman College. Whitman College is very proud of its tradition. It's very proud of its alumni. It's very proud that one of those was Adam West, who became Batman, and there's a few others that, when I saw the names, I really didn't recognise them. But when you walk in there, you can not help but be impressed with just what a beautiful campus it is, magnificent buildings, and when you go through the main gate, you actually see this statue of Marcus Whitman. So it intrigued me, because I love stories, and I thought, I bet you there's a story about Marcus Whitman. And so I've been doing a bit of research. So this is the likeness of Marcus Whitman. Born in 1802, became a doctor, and when he became qualified, he went to Canada, practiced as a doctor for 4 years, but in the 1830s, there was a tremendous revival going on in New York. There was this urgency that if you were a Christian, you had to get out there. You had to reach people that had never heard of Jesus Christ. And so Marcus left New York and was one of the first white men to actually travel right across over to the west coast, over the Rocky Mountains, and he went into what was then known as Oregon. And he saw this tribe of Indians, the Cayuses, and he determined that he wanted to go back there as a missionary, and he wanted to teach them all about the Jesus Christ that he knew. So he came back and he applied. He applied to the missionary board, and the missionary board ticked all the boxes, but there was one box he couldn't tick, and he couldn't go because he wasn't married. And while all this was happening, there was a Narissa Prentice, who at 16 gave her heart to God, and she, like Marcus, determined that she was going to be a missionary, and she was going to do exactly what Marcus was. So she applied to the same missionary board, and guess what? All the boxes were ticked except the one. She wasn't married. So Marcus heard about this young lady, and he said, "That's the girl for me." And so they started corresponding, and of course they realised that they had a lot more in common than just wanting to be missionaries. And so in early 1836 they got married, and they set off. They set off in a wagon train. Nerissa was actually the first white lady to ever cross the Rocky Mountains. And this picture here depicts when they made that unbelievable journey, 3,500 kilometres. It took nearly 8 months for them to do it. Some days were harder than others. But this picture here commemorates when they got to the top of the Rockies and realised that from there it was going to be downhill. Marcus had already arranged with the Cayuses that he would be given a particular plot of land, and he promised that he was going to pay them every year for the use of that land. And when they got there, there was lots to be done. And it had been an eventful trip. Nerissa kept a very careful diary, and during those months she kept recording about how wonderful it was. She had never ever had better health. She had never ever been happier. And during that long and arduous journey, guess what? She fell pregnant. And so when they actually set up home, Marcus was busy, and in no time at all, he had built these buildings. He'd established contact with the Cayuses. Nerissa was teaching them. He was practicing his medicine. Everything was going wonderfully well. And of course, little Alice. Alice was born in March 1837, the very first white child ever recorded as being born in Oregon. What a delight. It just seemed everything was going just so wonderfully well. The Indians at first were quite responsive, and then tragedy struck. Little Alice went down to the little lake that you see there to get some water. She fell in and she drowned. It's something that I'm sure Nerissa, as any mother, never got over. And at the same time as suffering that setback, Nerissa began to go blind. And her diary records the tragedy and the depression that she felt. So poor Nerissa and Marcus, from the promising start, things started to go AWOL. The Indians were no longer responsive. And so in 1842, Marcus received word from the missionary board that they were going to cancel his credentials and recall them to New York. So Marcus made, and imagine it, 1842, going back that 3,500 kilometres, he went back over to New York, he addressed the board, and he persuaded them to give them a second chance. And when he returned with a wagon train, which became known as the Oregon Trail. You can see there were probably a lot of undesirables, but it really wasn't just the undesirables that came, because the sad thing came was that it wasn't just people, they came with diseases. Diseases that the Indians had never ever had any resistance to. And the thing that became just such a problem for them was measles. The measles became just such a problem that Marcus was just run off his feet. He was ministering to the Indians, he was ministering to the settlers, and from where the Indians stood, he wasn't doing a good job, because nearly all the settlers' children were surviving and recovering, and nearly all of the Indian children died. The Indians formed the view that he was poisoning them, that he was killing them off, so that all of these people that he was bringing over could take over their land and take over their community. So in 1847, there was what they described as the Whitman Massacre. The Indians arrived at their little mission station, and they killed Marcus, they killed Nerissa, they killed 11 other people, and then they took 50 hostages. It, of course, was just an absolute and utter disaster for everybody. But the powers that be realised that they couldn't sit idly by. They had to do something about it. And so in went the militia. And as the militia came in, the Kayusi moved out of their grounds and up north to escape. But it was hopeless for them. And eventually the chief realised there was only one thing he could do to save his people, and that was to surrender. And he surrendered himself with 4 other people, and they were tried. They were tried in a trial that became an absolute farce, because the people that gave witness and testimony against them were not even there. So they were condemned to death, condemned to a public hanging. And the papers all recorded that on the day of the hanging, the chief stepped forward, and when he was invited to say the last words, he said, "I stand here before you. You came here, you taught me that your Jesus Christ died so that you could live. I have surrendered myself, and I stand here and I will die to save my people." And thus the last words were spoken, and he was hanged. The sad thing is that this tragedy, of course, meant that all of their dreams went up in ashes. And if you go to the Whitman mission station now, you'll see this plot here. This marks the spot where Marcus and Nerissa and the other martyrs, as they call them, are now buried. The mission no longer has any function other than as a historical place of interest. The Kayusi people no longer exist, because although the chief gave his life, the people never returned to where they came from. Their community was totally destroyed, and what was left of the tribe, they joined the other tribes that were in the northern areas where they were left. A tragedy. And I thought, how could that happen? How could that possibly happen when you're sure that those people went there with the very best of intentions? They went there surely with God's blessing, and it all started off just so wonderfully well. What could have gone wrong? What was the error? Well, if you actually look at this logo for Whitman College, it starts to give you an idea, I think, of what they did wrong. Because this is the logo of Whitman College that depicts Marcus and Nerissa. And you'll see a couple there, sort of like Davy Crockett, and Marcus is holding the Bible, and he's got a gun, and Nerissa has got a pistol. And you think, how can somebody, up until 2016, have that as the mascot of their Christian college? And when you actually go into and read the diaries of Nerissa and Marcus, you start to get some indication of what went wrong. Because when Nerissa recorded in her diary how repugnant she was feeling towards the Indians, how she hated the fact that when she went into mealtime there were 4 or 5 Indians in there, and how dirty they were, and how filthy they made the place. And she said, "We've come here to raise them up to our standard, not to get down to their level." When you realise that when the Indians came and said to Marcus, "You remember when you came here and we made this deal that you were going to pay us a rental for our land every year?" You know what Marcus said? "Oh, I think it should be a gift." And when he grew crops, instead of, as in the Indian community, you share all of this with everybody, they were appalled because he was selling this to whoever paid the most money for it. And at the Indian trial, their defence, and only defence, was it was customary in their community that if the medicine man failed, you killed him. And that was their only defence. But that was their custom. So thinking about that and thinking about what they did and how they ignored what was a beautiful and thriving community trying to thrust their views, their principles, their standards, made me question, how often do we do it? How often do we go into these communities and expect people to come up to our standards? How often do we fail? And what really should our church be? What is community? And when I actually looked in the Bible, I saw that there are many, many verses that talk about alone, another. And I've been going to church all my life, and yet I have never heard one sermon on the another principles. And yet, if you have a look there, another is used 100 times in 94 New Testament verses. At least 47, and some commentators actually rate it higher than that. They're instructions given to people and followers of Jesus. Now, Paul, of course, wrote 60% of those. But what is it all about? Well, remember in Sabbath school, remember joy. If you want joy, what does it mean? Jesus first, others second, yourself last. And when you actually look at all of these and other verses, you'll see they fall basically into three categories. A third of them talk about love. Love one another, through love serve one another, tolerate another, greet one another with a kiss, be devoted to another. And a lot of these categories actually merge. And a lot of commentators say it's not just love. Another category that you can actually look at is edifying, to strengthen each other, to reinforce each other, to give each other comfort and strength. One of the other categories is humility. And what humility really means is being of service to others. And that is why we call the foot service the service of humility. Because what it makes you do is realize that the greatest benefit and blessing that you can get out of life is to actually serve and be helpful and a friend to those in need. But the other big category is this one, unity. 1/3, unity. Be at peace with one another. Don't grumble amongst one another. Be of the same mind. Accept one another. Wait for one another. Don't bite. Gently. All of those things. That is what community is all about. If you're in a clique or if you're in a club, then when you break the rules, you're out. What community and what these one another verses teach us is that in a church community, and the community that you and I really want to belong to, is that you will never walk alone. It doesn't matter what you face, you will always have somebody in that community being there by your side. So why am I here? Well, let me share. This is a photograph taken 54 years ago. It is my family, and I'm very happy that I have my brother, John, who is sitting down there, and my little sister Barbara, who was 18 months. That is the last photograph that was ever taken of our family. And it was just before Christmas in 1965. It's a time that most people think, well, it's a time to be happy, it's a time to be joyful. And I can tell you that we felt like that too when that photograph was taken, because we were looking forward to the traditional family Christmas, all the things that kids look forward to. And yet, within a few days of that photograph being taken, my father went to the school breakup where he was the master, and he never came home. He died. He died unexpectedly. And I still remember getting the phone call from the headmistress as she was trying to find out where my mother was, because she'd gone to another function and they were trying to find her to give her the sad news. And I remember when Mum finally came home, the tears, the pain, and I remember going to bed that night just feeling so helpless, so hopeless. Here we were, my father was the only breadwinner. How were we going to survive? Dad, who was also a builder, had started renovating the house, and here we were in a house that was totally unfinished. Things just looked so hopeless. And while I'm thinking that and not getting any sleep, my mother was praying. She was praying and seizing hold of the promise that God gives in Psalm 68. She shared that with us much later, but it's a promise that has always given me strength. It's always made me feel special. And the day after, the people came. They came. There were cards and words, and some of them pretty hopeless. Some of them suggesting it's God's will. These things happen. You'll be better off in the long run. And you think, really? Is this God's will? And in the middle of it, I saw a car pull up. And I saw the man from church who had the worst stutter that you can imagine. And as he got out of the car, I thought, oh boy. He was the sort of fellow whose stammer was so bad and so embarrassing, you just avoided even saying anything to him because you knew it was going to often be painful. And as he got out of the car, I thought, oh no, what is he going to say? What is he going to do? And he came to the back of his car, lifted up the boot, and he took out a lawnmower. And without saying anything at all, came into our place and started mowing the lawn. Of all the things said, all the cards, all the gifts, that was the most eloquent sermon. That is something I will never forget. And that is why I'm here today, because I love this community. I know, and I knew from that moment, that whatever I face, I will never face it alone. And so, what I want to leave with you is the thought that words are cheap, but you can, and everyone can mow a lawn. And that action, that small action, when one of us hurts, you are hurting. In a community, when you're asked, how are you? You can't say, I'm okay, unless everybody in your community is okay. Because in a community, you care. In a community, you want to make sure that whoever is hurting, whoever has pain, you're going to be there for them. And that, my friends, is the thought I want to leave with you at the end of this year and the thought as you go into the next year, and the thought that as we soon will be in our new church, I want you to make our church not a clique, not a club, but a community. Dear Father, we want a happy place, but we know in this old world it's not always going to be happy. And yet we know that we are not alone. We know that we can help when our fellow believers, when our neighbours, when those we come in contact with need our help. Help us to be there for them and make their load a little lighter. We thank you for your love. We thank you for your promise, and we look forward to living with you forever. Amen.